Hi, my name is Grace, and today I will be presenting the ethical questions raised by the real-life case that inspired the novel and book My Sister's Keeper. And so this story centers on Anissa Ayala, a teenager who was diagnosed with leukemia at the age of 16. And she was born to Mary and Abraham Ayala. And she was rapidly declining after she got diagnosed. And the doctors told her she needed a bone marrow transplant. And so, I'm going to go to the next slide. And thinking about bone marrow transplants back then, the registry was only made up of probably 17,000 people, whereas now it's 10 million people. So to need a bone marrow transplant during the 1980s, it was almost a miracle if you got one. And so Mary and Abraham, they were desperate. And this ultimately ended up with them conceiving Marissa. And when they got pregnant with Marissa, they did not know if she would be a donor. It just happened to be that she did turn out to be a donor. But the only reason that they had Marissa was the hope that she would be. And this picture over here to the left, that is just a picture of the movie that was based off of this case. So my presentation will be broken up into 3 parts. Right here is just the background facts, and then I'm going to talk about the apply ethical principles in the case. And then lastly, I'll just talk about my stance on it, based off of the permitted, forbidden, or required stance. Okay. Alright, so the first principle I'm going to talk about is the principle of autonomy. And this principle is the belief that every person has the right to make informed decisions about their body and life. But what they call a savior baby, like Marissa, they cannot consent to being born for a specific purpose. And they can't agree to medical procedures that aren't necessarily needed. Now, kids, they have medical procedures all the time, but they're under usually circumstances that need to happen, like emergency surgeries. But something like a bone marrow transplant, that's not needed. So that interferes with the principle of autonomy, not being able to make that choice about that surgery. And this raises ethical concerns. If the child has no say in the matter, is their autonomy completely ignored from the very start? And so we're going to talk about the next one, benevolence. And the principle of benevolence emphasizes doing good, helping others in need. And Anissa's parents wanted to save their daughter. They were desperate to save Anissa. And from their point of view, we can see having another child was an act of love and hope. If Marissa's procedure caused no long-term harm, some might say it was a win for everyone and we should just move on. But this principle only holds true if no harm was done to the donor child. Everyone's needs have to be met, and emotionally or physically. And it's true that benevolent as a child grows up used or burdened, and that can create, just kind of a mental fall. Even good intentions don't automatically justify an action. Just because Anissa ended up living doesn't mean that it was ethically right how it got there. Okay, and then the last principle I'm going to apply to this case is the principle of paternalism. And the principle of paternalism is the idea of making choices for someone who cannot make their own, but making sure it's in their best interest. So, like a parent making decisions for their child when they cannot yet. And paternalism means making those choices with their best interest at heart. And in this case, Marissa's parents decided her role before she was born. She didn't get to choose whether to be a donor. The decision was built into her identity. And even if the parents believe they're doing what's best, paternalism becomes unethical when it treats the child as a tool rather than a person. Can creating a child with predetermined purpose ever be fully in their best interest? Can making them go through painful medical procedures and spending days in the hospital when it wasn't needed, is that putting them at their best interest? And some might say, well, Anissa's best interest was at play. She needed this. But we have to look from all sides of the story. There were multiple people involved. And then the next page just talks about other ethical concerns that I had to think about in order to make my stance that we'll get into in just a second. And the first ethical concern that I really had to think hard about was the psychological impact that can be put on a donor child. And the donor child might grow up asking, was I wanted for myself or to just save my sibling? And that kind of uncertainty could affect self-esteem, identity, or the relationship with the family. It can cause some very strange dynamics there. And in Marissa's case, it seems to be that she grew up and she seems to be doing okay, and their family does seem to have a good dynamic, but that was this case, that's not, we have to think about other cases that this might open doors to. And so that leads me into the instrumentalization of conception. And talking about this, I'm really coming from the point of using someone as a means to an end. If the child is created only for the purpose of saving another, it reduces their value as an individual. They're used as a tool. And then the final question that I really had to go over was the medical versus moral obligation. And just because we can use technology in these medical things to create a genetic match, that doesn't mean we should. And now in this case, Marissa was conceived naturally. There was no genetic modification, but it can lead others to start doing this because it was successful in this end. So it really puts a strain on that. Okay, and then the next slide we're getting into my stance. And my stance I made up of the principles we just talked about: autonomy, benevolence, and paternalism. And I fit that into the categories of should it be permitted, forbidden, or required. And so here I just individually talked about each principle, and rather it should be permitted, forbidden, and required. And when it comes to autonomy, I believe creating a donor child is forbidden. The donor child has no ability to consent and may be subjected to medical decisions they can't influence. A 14-month-old can't possibly consent to an unnecessary bone marrow transplant. And I don't think that parents' control over a child should limit their autonomy. There are some cases, a child shouldn't be going to get a tattoo. But when it comes to cases that bring risk, like medical procedures that don't have to be done, then I think that would mess with autonomy. And then just talking about paternalism, that I also put forbidden for paternalism because it overrides the future autonomy of the child by assigning them a purpose before birth. They chose this for Marissa, and they weren't thinking about her best interest, they were thinking about Anissa's. So Marissa's best interests in this case, they were ignored, which goes against paternalism. And then under benevolence, I think this act could be permitted, but only if the child is unharmed, away from risk, fully supported, and eventually understands and agrees to the role. And by this, I mean they're old enough to cognitively understand what being a donor is and the risks behind these procedures. And so that wouldn't really be a donor baby then, because they wouldn't have been made for this specific purpose. And so I would think it would make that ethical then. If they were conceived as an individual and their value is the front part of why they were born and not just to be a donor, then I think it would be okay for a child to be a donor if they're at that age where they can consent to that. And then the last slide, I kind of just summarized my entire stance. And so the principle of autonomy says creating a donor child should be forbidden. The child can't choose that role. The child cannot choose to be a donor and have unnecessary medical procedures happen to their body. And then the principle of paternalism says that this is forbidden because it ignores the donor child's best interest. However, the principle of benevolence allows for a more limited stance and could be permitted, but only if the child is unharmed, free of risk, and eventually can cognitively consent to being a donor. And that kind of wraps up the presentation. Ultimately, the ethics of this issue depend on how we value children as people with rights, not as solutions to problems. They're not a means to an end. They should be born because the parents want a child, not because they need this child for a specific purpose that is not in their best interest. And so my last slide are just the works cited pages I used in my 3 sources. Thanks for listening.